The execution began at 600 hours, Klareth Standard Time. A sharp tone echoed through the dim corridors of Omega-7, jolting the detainees from restless half-sleep. In Sector D, the isolation ring reserved for high-risk species, one of the cells opened with a hiss, and a human prisoner was dragged out by two Klareth enforcers, their sinewy limbs wrapped in armor of organic chrome. The human didn't struggle. His face was bruised, but his eyes remained fixed forward, calm, resigned, yet defiant. Harlan Vex stood silently behind the reinforced synth glass of his cell wall. The execution platform lay just across the corridor, elevated slightly above the floor, surrounded by pale blue sensor drones that hovered like predatory insects. The Klareth judge appeared, 6 eyes, veiled beneath translucent folds, glowing with bioelectric pulses. It spoke in clicking bursts. The translation device overhead rendered the words with deadpan efficiency. Unit 927 Species, Homo sapiens. Crime, subversive conduct. Charge, unauthorized manipulation of neural conduits with intent to transmit. The prisoner didn't flinch. He only turned his head just slightly toward the cells. Harlan met his gaze. Then the signal was given. The execution drone pierced the human skull with a high-frequency impulse. A flash, a soundless vibration, the body collapsed. Lifeless, Harlan didn't move. His face remained blank. But his right hand gripped the edge of the wall panel until his knuckles turned white. His breath slowed, deep, controlled, but inside was a storm. Rage, guilt, fear, all swirling beneath the surface like a buried current. When the drones dispersed, the guards returned to collect the body. One of them barked something in Klareth tongue, some guttural insult. Then they dragged the corpse across the floor, smearing a faint line of crimson-black fluid behind. That was when Harlan saw it. A sliver of tubing, barely the length of a finger, embedded in the prisoner's wrist, half burned. Half fused with flesh, but unmistakable, he knew that tubing. It was part of a fluidic coupler he had scavenged from the waste filters last week. He had fashioned 3 prototypes for a makeshift signal amplifier. One had gone missing, so that's where it ended up. He turned away slowly, walking back to the rear wall of his cell, where a narrow metal bench ran along the surface. He sat, silent. The execution wasn't unexpected. Rumors of a human trying to broadcast out of Omega-7 had been circling for days. What Harlan hadn't known, what chilled him now, was that someone had used his asterisk design. That it had worked, that it had cost a life. He looked up at the ceiling. A tiny fracture, barely visible unless you knew where to look, split the surface above the northeast corner of his cell. It wasn't natural, not quite. A tremor 2 months ago had shaken the entire outer ring. And Harlan had spent nights mapping microcracks ever since. That fracture led somewhere. Not to the open sky Omega-7 was buried deep within the gaseous crust of Klareth, but to a pressure tube, and from there to the array spine, a massive column of neural relays and sensory amplifiers, embedded into the facility like a central nervous system. He had calculated the resonance range. The fracture offered a window, narrow, unstable, dangerous, but enough to push a signal out. If only briefly, the dead man had tried, and now he was gone. Harlan leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the cold wall. The artificial humidity of Omega-7 made everything damp, metallic, and faintly sour. The scent of biosynthetic decay lingered in the vents. It was the smell of a place designed not just to contain, but to erase. A sudden buzz sounded from the corridor, another announcement, this time less formal. A shift in guard schedule, a notice about food rations. Harlan barely heard it. In his mind, the calculations had already resumed. Frequencies, power limit, pulse modulation, and risk. His design worked. The amplifier wasn't a theory anymore. It was asterisk proof asterisk. Even if incomplete, even if fatal, he could abandon it. Stay silent. Follow the routine of Omega-7. Wake, eat, think, sleep, repeat. Or he could finish what the other man started. Improve the signal. Find a way to boost its duration. Reach the outer systems. Reach Earth. Reach someone. His chest tightened. He thought of the images he hadn't let himself remember in weeks. The oceans of Terra Nova, the sound of his sister's laughter, the feel of gravity that didn't shift with each atmospheric pulse. He exhaled slowly. Was it worth dying for? And worse, was it worth letting others die? If another signal triggered another execution, his eyes drifted toward the floor where the blood trail had ended. Nothing remained now, just polished synth stone, already cleansed by Omega-7's auto-filtration system. The Klareth didn't leave marks, they removed them. But Harlan remembered, and he wasn't the only one. Across the corridor, 3 cells down, someone was watching him. Aelra, quiet hybrid, eyes that flickered with colors not found in any known spectrum. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze locked on his. He held it a beat past, then she nodded, barely perceptible. Harlan's jaw tightened. He turned back to the wall, staring up at the fracture. And then, beneath his breath, more thought than sound, he spoke. How long? Before they come for me. A pause, then quieter still, or before I make them. The hum of Omega-7 continued, mechanical, indifferent. But something had shifted. The war hadn't ended, not here. Not yet. 3 years ago, Harlan Vex vanished without a trace. Official records listed him as presumed dead in the Tiamat Rift incident. When the research vessel Daedalus was torn apart by a gravitational rupture near the edge of the helix expanse. What no one knew, what no one could have guessed, was that one escape pod had ejected seconds before the detonation. And that pod had drifted straight into the patrol web of the Klareth Dominion. The Klareth didn't kill him, they studied him. They wanted to know how human engineers could craft signal relays, compact enough to fold microcurrents within the spectrum of sentient neural energy. Harlan never told them. Instead, they threw him into Omega-7, one of their hidden prison camps suspended deep within the gas layers of their homeworld, Klareth Prime. In Omega-7, names were irrelevant. Only species designations mattered. Harlan was specimen H301. A code, a cell, and a life reduced to routines. Wake, count, consume, obey, repeat. But Harlan was not a soldier. He didn't resist with fists or fire. He resisted with thought. Before the Daedalus he had been one of the youngest senior engineers in the Interstellar Signal Corps, a specialist in pulse encoding and nonlinear neural transmission. His job wasn't combat, it was connection, making meaning travel faster than fear. That, perhaps, was why the Klareth considered him dangerous. They understood technology, they did not understand belief. Inside the cold symmetry of Omega-7, that belief had started to decay. Days passed like dust particles, weightless and numberless. Even time didn't seem to move properly here, as if the thick atmospheric pressure bent not just light, but memory. Still, Harlan remembered Earth, vividly, the scent of burned wiring after a successful stress test. The way his sister used to knock on his workbench with knuckles instead of words. He remembered sunlight, not the artificial glow of Klareth bulbs, but real light, filtered through a blue sky. Those memories came less frequently now. They were being overwritten by metal. And then there was Aelra. She occupied the cell across from his. A hybrid, her skin bore the faint ripple texture of Klareth biology. But her voice, when she spoke, carried the resonance of something gentler. Something older. She was part Quarren, a race believed to be extinct after the Klareth purges 2 generations ago. Aelra rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in fragments. Questions without context, warnings with no target. Harlan wasn't sure whether she was broken or just pretending. "You see too clearly," she once said to him through the reinforced glass. "They'll take your sight." "What do you mean?" he had asked. She had only smiled, sadly, like someone who had seen the ending of a story long before it was told. Now, days after the execution, that conversation came back to him. He hadn't been able to sleep. The stench of scorched tissue lingered in his cell, psychosomatic but impossible to ignore. So when the automated voice summoned him to maintenance duty during sleep cycle, he didn't protest. Omega-7 was self-sustaining, but it still needed hands for low-level repairs. The Klareth used prisoners for that. It saved them energy. Tonight, the task was simple: replace the filtration rods in the hydro generator beneath Sector E. But the route took him past Storage Sector 4B, the biomodule archive. He wasn't meant to stop there. His ID tag would trigger a motion alarm if he lingered more than 20 seconds outside of assigned range. He gave himself 10, just 10, enough to glance sideways as he passed the half-open hatch. And there it was, sitting on a shelf, half buried beneath a pile of failed prototypes, a microwave coupler assembly. Marked with Terran serials, human, Earth-built. Harlan froze. His breath caught. For a split second, he wasn't in Omega-7. He was back on Earth, in Substation Delta, watching this exact component hum as it latched to a frequency converter. He remembered designing the cooling grid to prevent signal collapse under biopressure. Why was this here? Who brought it? And more importantly, was it functional? His fingers twitched. 9 seconds left. He stepped closer, no alarms yet. He reached out, not to grab it but to trace its outline with his eyes. The welds, the power inlet. It was a communications-grade unit, no doubt. Old model but still capable. If rigged properly, it could amplify a weak signal through dense atmosphere, especially one like Klareth with layered ion streams. 8 seconds. He turned, walked, kept his pace steady. 30 meters later, his knees buckled slightly. Not from exertion, but from something deeper, shock maybe. Hope or dread. He returned to his cell without incident. The guards didn't question him. The maintenance logs would show routine completion. No flags, no suspicion, but he couldn't sleep. The image of the coupler burned in his thoughts. He sat on his bench, staring at the floor, and whispered under his breath. "They brought something in, or someone." Across the corridor, Aelra stirred. "You saw it," she murmured. He looked up. "You knew." She didn't answer immediately. Her voice came seconds later, hushed and deliberate. "They test all frequencies, but some still slip through. That one they couldn't decode, so they hid it. Why tell me now? Because someone will try again. And if it's you, you need to know where not to touch." Harlan leaned forward. "That's not an answer." "It never is," she replied. A moment passed, then silence, but something had changed. The decay of belief had paused, just briefly, and in its place the glimmer of design returned. Because for the first time in years, Harlan Vex saw a signal. Weak, faint, but real, and real was enough to begin. It took Harlan 3 full cycles to steal the microwave coupler. Not in a dramatic escape or a midnight heist, just patience, precision, and the exploitation of the one constant truth in any system: no one watches what they think they understand. Storage Sector 4B had no cameras. The Klareth didn't need them. The sector was laced with sensor threads, tuned to track electromagnetic shifts and unauthorized bioelectric signatures. But the coupler, an old Terran part, emitted nothing unless powered. To the Klareth, it was inert, forgotten junk. Harlan timed his next maintenance shift. On the 3rd cycle, as he performed his assigned task inspecting oxidation points in the oxygen vent nozzles, He rerouted his path through a defunct crawlspace, one he'd, accidentally, triggered a repair request for weeks ago. Inside that space, beneath a collapsing conduit panel, he'd planted a decoy, a scrap metal joint mimicking a cracked compression node. He took the long route. No one followed. When he reached storage 4B, the hatch was slightly ajar, just as before. Inside, the lights buzzed dimly, casting a soft green glow over towers of obsolete tech. His fingers brushed the coupler, cold, dense, real. He slipped it into the hollow shaft of his maintenance tool, clipped magnetically, and sealed the casing shut. No alarms, no footsteps. It was only when he returned to his cell that he let himself breathe. He hid the coupler behind the sanitation panel, lodged inside a fractured piece of pipe that hadn't seen water in months. He rigged a basic insulator using bedding thread soaked in synthetic oil. Crude, but enough to keep the Klareth sensors from flagging anomalies. Then he waited and planned. At night, when the lights dimmed and the pressure cycles lulled the guards into idle stillness, Harlan pulled out tiny fragments of charcoal from burned rations and mixed them with blood from a self-inflicted scratch. On the underside of his metal sleeping bench, he began to sketch. Waveforms, relay patterns, burst encoding sequences. If someone had entered his cell and looked beneath the bench, they would have seen only smeared grime. But to Harlan it was a map, a pulse path, a way out. He worked in silence until Aelra spoke. "Your bench is bleeding," she said. Harlan paused, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, I can smell it." "Charcoal and copper iron, you're drawing." He considered denying it, but there was no point. Aelra saw more than anyone else in Omega 7, maybe because she had nothing left to lose. "I'm not broadcasting," he said calmly. "Not yet." She stepped closer to the edge of her cell, resting her hand against the partition. "You don't understand the Klareth. I understand enough to know they're not gods. They don't need to be. Their systems are alive. Anything you send out comes back. If you light a match here, it'll burn in your lungs before it warms your skin." He stood and approached the wall, meeting her gaze through the transparent partition. "I'm not trying to warm anyone. I'm trying to get out." "No one gets out." That's what they said about the exile tunnels on Titan. And someone got out. Aelra's eyes flared, not with anger but something deeper. Memory, maybe. She stepped back, then reached into the folds of her garment. From within, she pulled a small, wrinkled sheet of translucent film, coated in blue data nodes and vein-like lines. She pressed it against the glass. "Spinal map of Omega 7, she whispered. "Stolen from my father. He was a command-grade Klareth before he realized he loved the wrong species." Harlan's breath hitched. He leaned closer. The diagram was detailed, almost too detailed. It mapped the neural lattice of the station's feedback system. The way signal pulses were rerouted through organic sensors and modulated in the relay cortex deep beneath Sector Zeta. With this, he could avoid triggering the reflection feedback. He looked at her. "Why give this to me?" "Because someone has to try again." "And you're not suicidal, not yet." Harlan didn't thank her. He simply took the image into his memory and began recalculating everything. That night, as he lay awake, the real weight of it began to press in. He could build the transmitter. He could shape the burst, isolate the waveform, bounce it through dead sectors, and send a single signal up the fracture shaft above his cell. If the relay caught it, it might reach the satellite net orbiting Klareth Prime. It might reach Earth, but what then? Omega 7 wasn't just a prison. It was full of prisoners, beings like Aelra, like the Quarren girl in Block C who hadn't spoken in months, like the hybrid child chained in Sector H, drawing stars into the dust with her toe every morning before food cycle. Would the signal trigger alarms? Would the Klareth react by cleansing the prison, if help came? Would it arrive in time to save anyone but him? And if not, would that still be worth it? He didn't know. He didn't sleep, and the next morning the circuit nearly killed him. It happened during inspection hour. A Klareth patrol drone floated past his cell, routine sweep. Harlan was seated on his bench, arms folded, eyes closed. Then a spark, a pulse. It was faint, so faint it shouldn't have registered. But it did. The drone paused. A slit opened along its midline, revealing a glowing lens. It emitted a sharp ping. The cell door remained locked, but a red pulse lit briefly across the panel. The signal had leaked. Something in the coupler assembly, maybe a polarity drift, maybe a current bleed, had sent a ghost ping up the conduit line. Not enough to be traceable, but enough to get attention. Seconds later, the outer hatch hissed. A Klareth enforcer stepped in, eyes scanning. Its voice cracked like split stone. Unscheduled inspection. Stand, Harlan stood. The Klareth moved quickly, more animal than sentient. It searched the panel seams, the bedding, the vent shaft. It approached the sanitation panel. Harlan's heart slammed against his ribs. And then a noise from the corridor, a scream, Sector H. The enforcer paused. A high-pitched Klareth transmission flickered through its comm. Then it turned, hissing, and stormed out. The door sealed shut. Harlan didn't move for 5 full minutes. Then, slowly, he knelt at the sanitation panel, opened it, and pulled out the coupler. It was warm, still intact, still alive. He pressed it to his forehead for one long, silent second. Then he whispered, "You just made your first sound." And the war within him got louder. The final piece was water. Not the sterile processed, droplets rationed in daily cubes, but the deep flow waste circulation line that ran beneath Omega-7 like a forgotten artery, thick, grimy, ancient. It was the only system in the facility that hadn't been rewired into the Klareth's neural grid. They didn't need to monitor excrement, but Harlan did. For weeks, he had studied the pressure pulses through the drainage channel in his cell's corner vent, listening to the timing, measuring the flow against the daily flux cycle. It ran upwards for a brief moment every 64 minutes, toward the atmospheric equalizers near the surface ridge. In that pulse, tiny, violent brief, was the window. He had soldered the microwave coupler into a casing made of meal trays and melted ration wrappings. It looked like a piece of junk, because that's what it had to be. The signal converter was embedded inside a casing of rusted filtration wire, and the power source was scavenged from his cell's diagnostic panel, rewired to emit a burst instead of sustain. A one-time shot, a signal sent through filth and condensation up into gas density where the Klareth sensors thinned. It was primitive, and it might work. He tested nothing. He couldn't afford to. The moment any signal was caught, the system would scan for the origin. He had exactly one shot. That night, after the third atmospheric pulse had cycled and the guards slipped into their sleep phase, he made the final connection. His heart was thudding too fast. The coupler buzzed, not loudly, just a hum like static behind his teeth. It was working. He reached toward the switch. Then he heard her voice. "You're really going to do it?" He froze. Aelra stood at the edge of her cell, face bathed in shadows. "How long have you been watching me?" he asked quietly. "Long enough to know what that thing will do," Harlan swallowed. "It's a distress call, that's all." "No," she said, stepping closer. "Not here, not with the Klareth. Their neural grid isn't passive, it's reflexive. Every pulse through the central array bounces back with equal force. It's their defense. It's how they prevent rebellion." He stared at her, not fully understanding. "You're saying the signal will be mirrored. I'm saying it will trigger a kill reflex." Her voice cracked, but her eyes stayed steady. "Every being within the array with any form of biological coupling, anyone with Klareth-engineered nerve imprints, will be hit with a feedback burst." Harlan's throat dried. "You have Klareth DNA. More than that. I was born here. My father built this place. Half my nervous system is threaded into the spine of this prison." She gave a broken smile. "If you send that signal, I'll be the first to die." Silence stretched like wire between them. He looked down at the coupler. The casing flickered faintly, impatient. "Ready." "You told me to try," he said, barely audible. "I did. Then why warn me now? Because trying and killing aren't the same thing." He sat slowly on the floor, his back against the cold metal. "There's no other way," he said. "If I don't send it, we die here. One by one, or worse, we live, forever forgotten." She didn't respond. His hands trembled. "How many will it hit?" "At least 3 dozen. Maybe more. The signal won't differentiate. It's not designed to." His voice dropped hoarse. "Are you willing to die if that death breaks the loop?" Her reply came without pause. "Yes," he looked up sharply. "But not because you ask me to," she continued. "Because I've lived long enough inside this cage. Because if someone somewhere hears us, even for a second, maybe they'll remember that we were alive." Harlan's breath caught. He closed his eyes. In his head he saw her face. Then others. The silent child in Sector H, the old man with the stitched eyes who whispered to himself each morning. The Quarren twins, who held hands through the cracks in their shared wall. He saw his sister, her face blurred now with time. He opened his eyes. "Then I won't fail," he said. She nodded once, solemn, and disappeared into the dark. He waited for the 64-minute cycle. He counted the heartbeats. At 0 hour he pressed the trigger. There was no sound, no explosion, no burst of light. Just a pulse, a whisper that no one heard, but something did. Far above the prison, in the iron-thick skies of Klareth Prime, an old relay station caught a signal it hadn't heard in years. A Terran frequency, fragmented, weak, but undeniably human. It blinked once, and passed it on. By morning the storm had begun. A scream echoed through Sector D. Harlan sat still in his cell, breathing slowly. He didn't speak, he didn't move. Across the corridor, Aelra was gone. In her place, 2 Klareth enforcers stood with neural staves. They were scanning her space, whispering in sharp clicks. One of them barked toward Harlan's cell. He didn't flinch. A moment later, the command was relayed. Aelra had been taken to the judiciary chamber. Her genetic composition had triggered a reaction spike in the array. She was being accused of unlawful contact, of biological sabotage. It was a charge worse than treason. For hybrids, it meant immediate erasure. But no one mentioned Harlan, no one searched his cell. The signal had passed through the waste network, untraceable. At least for now. Still, something was wrong. A guard had died that morning, his brainstem overloaded by an unknown pulse. His body was found near the central core, burned from within. The Klareth called it a systems anomaly, but it was. It was the first echo. The signal had touched the array, and the array had responded. The system knew, and it was waking up. That night Harlan curled around the transmitter, shielding it like a child. He didn't sleep, he couldn't. Aelra hadn't returned. He imagined her standing before the judiciary, facing the hive-eyed judges, knowing the truth but saying nothing. He imagined her smile, that strange, haunted look she gave when she knew more than she let on. And he felt something break, guilt maybe, or something worse. Responsibility. He had sent the signal, she was paying the price. But somewhere, perhaps on the other side of the galaxy, someone now knew that Omega-7 existed. Someone had heard the scream in the dark, and that meant everything. Even if he never left this place, even if no one else did. He touched the transmitter one last time and whispered, "Don't die for nothing." Then he waited for whatever came next. Omega-7 didn't have alarms. It had pulses. That morning the air changed, denser, louder somehow. Vibrating with an undercurrent of tension that made every wall hum like a living thing. The prisoners felt it before they saw anything. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. No one spoke. In Harlan's cell, the hum became a pressure just behind his eardrums. Like a headache born of guilt and static, the lights shifted. Red bands flickered along the corridor walls. System alert. Then the voice came, deep and synthetic, echoing through every speaker in every section. Asterisk external signal breach. Foreign frequency detected. Source detention block 19. Harlan didn't move. He knew block 19. He was block 19. His fingers curled tighter around the edge of his bunk. He had sent the signal, but not like this. It was meant to be stealth, a flare, not a fire. But something had changed. Maybe the relay on the outer rim had amplified it. Maybe the Terran receivers had responded faster than expected. Or maybe the system had been more alive than anyone realized. He felt the transmitter beneath his bench, silent now but still warm. A moment later, the broadcast changed. Detention Unit A6, judicial interrogation initiated. Subject Ailra. The wall in front of him came alive. Without consent, without warning, every cell in Omega-7 was forced to witness the tribunal. The feed flickered, then locked. Ailra knelt at the center of a white hexagonal chamber, surrounded by 6 Klareth officers standing like statues. A neural conduit had been inserted into the base of her skull, linking her directly to the system's interrogation loop. Her eyes fluttered, her skin shook. Small arcs of energy danced across her spine like lightning kissing a fault line. She didn't scream, but she trembled. One of the officers spoke, translated flatly into Terran language. Asterisk subject Ailra. You are accused of internal sabotage and external signal collaboration. The emission pattern matches hybrid-compatible neural traces. Confirm or deny. She said nothing. The pulses increased. Her head jerked violently, but she didn't cry out. Blood ran from one nostril. Her jaw tightened until her teeth cracked. The voice continued, "You are shielding a source. We have isolated the signal's echo to block 19. You know who sent it. Is the human engineer responsible?" Still silence. The pulses surged again, now shaking the entire chamber. The other prisoners flinched as the feedback loop intensified. Even through the screen it hurt. And then, at last, Ailra lifted her head. Her eyes met the camera. She knew he was watching. A Klareth commander stepped forward. His voice was less flat, more curious. "Is the man worth your life?" There was a long pause. And she whispered, "No, but the future is." The screen cut out. Harlan collapsed backward, as if someone had punched the air out of him. The corridor outside his cell erupted in movement, Klareth enforcers rushing past, their staves lighting up, scanning. Locking down the block, they were closing in. He had minutes. Maybe less. He turned toward the sanitation vent, ripped it open, and pulled out the backup transmitter, the second pulse module he'd assembled, unstable, unfinished, dangerous. It wasn't meant to be used, unless this moment came. The moment he realized no one was coming to rescue them. The signal had asterisk reached the satellites. He saw it in the telemetry glitch inside the feed. Terran patrol ships had responded. They were coming, but not today, not fast enough, not for Ailra. Not for anyone still breathing. And worse, now that the signal had been traced, the Klareth would bury Omega-7. No trial, no executions, just a purge, clean, final. Unless the system was broken first, unless someone shut it all down. Harlan stared at the secondary module, cracked, humming faintly, barely held together with fused plastic and trembling hope. It wasn't just a transmitter, it was a disruptor. If he connected it to the base coupling of the waistline and fed it into the neural subloop, it would ripple upward through the spinal array, bypass the safety buffers, and flood the system with its own pulse, a recursive loop that would short-circuit every living sensor on the station. Omega-7 would go dark, completely, but not just the prison. If the feedback chain was strong enough, it would jump to the greater network. Wipe the Klareth's neural surveillance across the planetary system. The cages would fall, and so would the minds inside them. The cost: everyone connected to the neural array, anyone with implants, hybrid links, or sensory wiring, would seize collapse, and likely never wake again. Aelra, the Quarren girl. The child in Sector H and Harlan himself. He touched the device gently. This wasn't redemption. It was a choice without rescue, without comfort, without absolution, but perhaps it was the only kind that mattered. He crawled to the floor hatch, pried it open, and lowered the device into the drain. Then he paused. For a second he thought of Earth. Not the idea, but the sound: wind against glass, the clink of tools. His sister laughing over bad coffee. He had wanted to see that again. But he had also promised not to let Aelra die for nothing. He activated the pulse. The world blinked, first silence, then a low tremor, and then the lights went out everywhere. From space, the Terran patrol cruiser Vanguard picked up a signal anomaly. A pulse, originating from Omega-7, followed by a complete blackout of the Klareth sensory grid across 4 orbital sectors. No system failure of that scale had ever been recorded. The Klareth called it a catastrophic malfunction. The humans called it an opening. Inside the now-dead prison, the cells unlocked. Doors slid open with a hiss and died halfway through. No guards moved, no drones buzzed. There was no sound except the quiet shuffle of feet. In the corridor of Block 19, the body of a human man lay slumped against a wall, eyes open, hands still clutching a scorched transmitter. In the next cell, an empty chair. A small smear of blood on the floor, and etched into the bench, a sentence written in charcoal and dust: "If you hear us, remember we chose this, not to escape but to end the silence." The instant Harlan triggered the pulse, Omega-7 began to die. The feedback loop he'd unleashed burrowed into the prison's neural backbone like a fire-igniting dry bone. Power grids blinked, failed. Surveillance arrays collapsed. The signature Klareth hum, the ceaseless background vibration that marked every second of captivity, flickered, sputtered, and vanished. In Block 19, light failed first, then locks released with a hiss, powerless. Doors drifted open, not with freedom, with stillness. Guards screamed as their sensory implants overloaded. Their bodies spasmed, nerves burning from within. The Klareth enforcers, once shadows of fear, stumbled, fell, and twitched in pools of iridescent fluid. The neural system that once connected every thought, every command, every punishment, went dark. The Klareth had designed their control systems to respond like reflexes. But Harlan had turned those reflexes inward. The pulse hadn't just cut power. It had removed certainty. Some prisoners screamed. Others dropped to their knees in disbelief. A few simply sat down, as if unsure whether the silence was real. In a corner of Block A, Aelra lay curled on the floor, her arms wrapped around her chest. Her neural conduits had ruptured. Tiny threads of copper and plasma glass emerged from her back like wilted wires. Her breath came in slow, final intervals, but on her lips there was a smile. She had always known the cost. 72 hours later, the Terran patrol cruiser Vanguard entered orbit. Its scanners found no resistance. Omega-7's electromagnetic profile was unreadable, flattened. The entire neural grid had gone cold, like a star that had burned out without warning. What the boarding team discovered was a ruin, doors half opened. System scorched from within. No power, no heat, no movement except the prisoners. Some had survived, not many. Of the hundreds once catalogued, barely a few dozen emerged from the dark. None fully unscathed. Some were silent, Others had forgotten their names. A few held onto scraps of each other, memories, words, grief. In cell 19A, they found the body of a human man slumped near the floor hatch. The fingers were charred, muscles locked in rigor mortis, wrapped around a device fused to the panel wall. The face was unrecognizable, burned beyond identification, but the device still pulsed. It repeated a single encoded signal, buried beneath hundreds of encrypted layers. Protocol Vex 7. The engineers on Vanguard couldn't decrypt it fully. Not immediately, but they recognized the origin signature, Terran's signal core. High-grade engineering, dated 3 years prior, presumed lost. One of the crew whispered, "He made it work." No one said his name. Because they didn't know it, news spread fast. The destruction of Omega-7 was not a military event. It was never officially acknowledged by the Klareth Dominion. Within their ranks, they called it the system failure. But among Terrans and others once imprisoned, Omega-7 became legend. A facility that had no weaknesses, that operated on reflex, not logic. A machine that learned and punished, and then stopped. The name Vex 7 was etched into every Alliance database, flagged not as a person, but a protocol, a reminder that silence is not obedience, and that the most powerful circuits begin with a choice. They never recovered a full log of what happened inside. But they found pieces, a torn diagram etched into the underside of a sleeping bench. Signal schematics burned into panel walls, a transmitter melted, but still clinging to fragments of code. In a small memory unit almost overlooked, they found a message, distorted, corrupted, but partially recoverable. It played only once, a flicker of static, then a voice tired, calm, human. "If I don't survive, use intelligence, not vengeance, to build the world that comes after." A pause. "Don't build new prisons, even for those who once held you." Then silence. The unit burned out seconds later. Years passed. The war with the Klareth didn't end, but it changed. Without their neural surveillance grid, their dominion fractured. Systems once tightly controlled rebelled. Colonies declared autonomy. The Klareth lost the illusion of omniscience, and with it, the power that came from fear. New treaties were proposed, new oversight protocols established. But no one ever rebuilt Omega-7. It was declared a no-contact zone. A ruin preserved not out of shame, but remembrance. On the southern rim of Venus's second orbital ring, the Academy of Interstellar Engineering opened a new wing, dedicated to legacy systems, pulse technology, and ethics in network design. At the entrance there stood no statue, no photograph. Only a black steel plaque, engraved with a line, "For the ones who chose to act, even when no one would remember their names." One afternoon, a young engineer named Lysa from the third-year cadet cohort was given access to a restored transmitter shell recovered from Omega-7. She was the top in her class. Curious, relentless, she rebuilt the memory core with the help of an AI emulation engine. Restored damaged pulse sequences, cleaned static lines manually over 2 months. On the final attempt it played again, that voice. Worn thin by time, stretched by decay, but unmistakably human. "If you hear this, then you've made it further than I ever did." A pause, then softer. "We weren't heroes, we were just tired of waiting, so we reached out." Another pause. "Whatever you build next, build it better, build it kinder." The audio ended. Lysa sat in silence. She didn't know his name. No one did, but she remembered his words, and somehow that felt like enough. In the quiet hum of her lab, she scribbled a line into her notebook, the first line of her thesis. Vex 7 wasn't a machine, it was a message, and that message still echoed. Not just across systems, but across generations. a signal from the forgotten for those still choosing how to begin. Again,